Clifford Denton had a system for mornings, and he had kept to it without interruption for 12 years. He woke at 5:45. He put on the same worn slippers Lorraine had bought him the Christmas before she got sick. He walked downstairs without turning on the lights because he knew every step of that staircase the way a man knows the face of someone he has loved for a very long time. He filled the percolator, set it on the burner, and while it worked, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. That backyard had been his proving ground. He had laid the flagstone path himself in the spring of 1988, leveling each stone by eye because he did not trust a bubble level for finish work. He had built the tool shed in the corner with lumber salvaged from a demolished school gymnasium in Harrisburg, each beam inspected and selected by hand. He had planted the 2 oak trees the year Marcus started kindergarten, spacing them exactly 30 feet apart because he had read that oaks needed room to grow their root systems without competing. The oaks were tall now, taller than the house. He poured his coffee and sat at the corner of the kitchen table, the east-facing corner where the morning light came in strongest, and he opened the notebook. It was a standard engineering field book, the kind with the green cover and the water-resistant pages, but Lorraine had given him this particular one on their first anniversary with a note tucked inside the front cover. The note said, "For the man who fixes everything. Now fix this too." She had drawn a small arrow pointing at a blank page. He had never figured it out what she meant him to fix. He had kept the notebook anyway, and over 38 years it had become something else entirely, less a technical record and more a strange autobiography, columns of load calculations and drainage gradients, interrupted by small domestic notations written in the margins. He read one of those margin notes that morning. It was from September 3rd, 1989, the day Marcus was born. He had written in his careful block print, "Reinforced stair railing before leaving for hospital. Lorraine says I am avoiding anxiety. I told her this is how I prepare." He closed the notebook. He looked out the window again, and that was when he saw the white cargo van parked on the street in front of the house. It was not a neighbor's vehicle. He knew every car on this block by make and color and the particular way each one sat on its suspension. This van was new, commercial plates, and pulling up behind it, easing into the space just ahead of the fire hydrant where Marcus always parked when he visited, was his son's black Audi. Marcus did not visit on Tuesday mornings. Marcus did not visit much at all. Cliff set down his coffee and sat very still for a moment, the way he used to sit before beginning a structural assessment, letting his eyes take in everything before his mind began to form conclusions. Then he put on his boots, laced them slowly and correctly, and waited. The front door opened without a knock. Marcus came in first wearing a charcoal suit that Cliff recognized as the one he kept for client presentations. Yvette followed a half-step behind, carrying a manila folder pressed flat against her chest, the way paralegals carried files into conference rooms. They both wore the same expression, a practiced kind of composure that Cliff associated with people who had rehearsed what they were about to say several times in the car on the way over. They did not sit down. Marcus stood just inside the kitchen doorway. Yvette positioned herself slightly behind his left shoulder. "Dad," Marcus said, "we need to talk about the house." Cliff looked at his son. He looked at the folder in Yvette's hands. He looked at the cargo van idling outside the window. "All right," he said, "talk." Marcus spoke quickly, the way he always delivered difficult information efficiently, without pause, as though velocity itself might reduce the impact. The house had been sold. The buyer was Keystone Realty Group, a regional developer. The agreed price was $480,000. The contract had been signed 3 weeks ago. The new owners would take possession in 48 hours. And they had already arranged a place for Cliff, a facility called Sunrise Valley, out in Chester County, well-reviewed, fully staffed, $3,200 a month, with a room available starting Monday. Cliff did not speak during any of this. He sat with both hands flat on the table and listened the way he had listened to 1,000 project briefings completely and without interruption, because he had learned early in his career that a man who interrupts a briefing misses the details, and the details are always where the trouble lives. When Marcus finished, Cliff said, "Who signed the contract?" Yvette opened the folder and placed a document on the table in front of him. It was a deed transfer agreement notarized with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania seal in the lower left corner. And there on the signature line designated for the property owner was Cliff's name, his handwriting, his signature. He stared at it for a long time. 8 months ago, after the accident on the roof, after the 3 days in the hospital that had frightened everyone more than Cliff thought was warranted, Marcus had come to him with a proposal. It was a practical matter, he had said, an estate planning matter. If the house was in Marcus's name, there would be no probate complications, no delays, no legal entanglements if something happened unexpectedly. It was just paperwork, Marcus had said, family taking care of family. Cliff had signed because Marcus was his son, and because he had spent 48 years building things that were meant to last, and he believed that included the trust between a father and his child. He pulled the document closer and read every line of it, every clause, every condition, every representation. He read it the way he had always read contracts on the page, slowly looking for the operative language, the terms that would determine whether the whole thing held or collapsed. And the more he read, the clearer it became. The transfer had been complete and unconditional. The signature was valid. There was no legal ground beneath his feet. He set the document back on the table. "How long?" he asked. "How long were you planning to sell before you asked me to sign?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not how it happened." "I'm not asking how it happened. I'm asking how long you were already thinking about it." Yvette shifted her weight. She looked at the window. Marcus said, "The house is too much for you to manage alone. You know that." Cliff stood up from the table. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the door that connected the kitchen to the garage, opened it, and went inside. He came back carrying the engineering field book, the green-covered one 38 years thick. He set it on the table in front of Marcus and opened it to a page near the middle. "Page 47, he said. "Full electrical system replacement, first floor 2003. Code compliant, permitted, inspected. I pulled that permit myself." He turned pages. "Page 112. Microfracture repair, Northwest Foundation, corner, 2011. I caught that crack before it had moved 3 millimeters. The house inspector who looked at it said he had never seen a homeowner catch something that early." He turned more pages. "Page 203, complete replacement of the hot water distribution lines, 2018. I sweated those joints myself, every one of them." He closed the book. "That house has stood for 38 years because I understood what it needed before it knew it needed anything. So when you tell me it's too much for me to manage alone, I want to know exactly what you saw that I missed. Because I have not missed much." Marcus looked at the notebook. He looked at his father. And then he looked past both of them at the window at something outside that was easier to look at than either of those things. "It doesn't change anything, Dad." The silence that followed was not comfortable and was not meant to be. Yvette took the document back from the table, returned it to the folder, and closed it with a small, deliberate sound. She said carefully that the facility in Chester County had very good reviews. She said the room had a window that faced a garden. She said there were programs, activities, people his age. She said all of it in the tone of someone reading from a brochure they had memorized. Cliff looked at her when she finished. He said, "You could have called me Yvette before any of this. You could have picked up the phone and said, 'Cliff, we're thinking about making some changes,' and I would have answered. I have always answered." She did not respond to that. Cliff went to the kitchen drawer, the second one from the top on the left side, the one where he kept the house keys. He had 3 sets on a single ring, the original keys from 1984, when he and Lorraine had first moved in, worn smooth at the edges from decades of use. Attached to the ring was a small bottle opener shaped like a fish that Lorraine had bought at a county fair in 1991. He looked at it for a moment, then he unclipped the bottle opener from the ring. He set the fish-shaped piece of metal on the counter beside the sink. Then he put the key ring in Marcus's hand. Marcus took it without looking at it. By 9 o'clock, the work crew had arrived. 3 men in gray shirts who moved through the house with the particular efficiency of people who have cleared out many homes and have long since stopped thinking about what the homes meant to the people who lived in them. They went from room to room carrying boxes and tape guns and made decisions about the contents of each space with a kind of institutional speed that made Cliff feel like a bystander in a place where he had never been anything but the central fact. He did not watch for long. He went through the house ahead of them, one room at a time, and he collected the things he would not leave behind. The green field book from the kitchen table, the wedding photograph from the bedroom, the one in the walnut frame he had built himself on a Sunday afternoon in 1986, because the frames at the department store were not substantial enough for the photograph that would hold Lorraine's face for the rest of his life. And from the back of the bedroom closet shelf, a small metal strongbox with a locking mechanism he had never been able to open. The box had belonged to his father. After the old man died in 1998, Cliff had cleared out the apartment in Allentown and found the box among the few things his father had kept. He had searched for the key for a week and then given up, deciding that whatever was inside was probably nothing more than old insurance documents. He had kept the box anyway, the way you keep certain things, not because of what they contain, but because of what they represent. One of the crew, a young man with a barbed wire tattoo circling his left forearm, picked up the strong box from the pile of items in the hallway and moved to drop it into the large waste bin they had set up near the front door. Cliff's hand came out and closed around the man's wrist before the box had traveled 6 inches. He did not say anything. He simply held the man's wrist and looked at him, and the young man looked back, and then he set the box down on the floor and returned to what he had been doing. Cliff picked up the box and added it to the items he was keeping. He was sitting on the front steps with these 3 things beside him when Gwendolyn Parrish came across the street. Gwen was 71 and had lived in the house directly opposite Cliff's for 22 years. She was wearing gardening clothes and carrying 2 cans of Coca-Cola, which told Cliff she had been watching from her yard for some time and had gone inside to get them before coming over. She sat down beside him on the step without asking permission and handed him a can. He opened it. They sat quietly for a moment, looking at the van in the driveway and the activity visible through the open front door. "I saw the van this morning," Gwen said. "I figured." Cliff drank some of the Coca-Cola. "I've been going through it in my head," he said, though he was speaking mostly to himself. "Looking for the angle where I had a legal play. Some clause I missed. Some procedural error." Gwen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you call a lawyer?" "Not yet. Hard to find an angle from inside your own head." He looked at her. She was not wrong. "I will," he said. "I just needed to finish reading the document first." "And it's solid." He turned the Coca-Cola can in his hands. "Marcus is careful. I taught him to be careful." They sat there for another 20 minutes. The crew came and went through the front door. The afternoon lights shifted. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started up and ran for a while and then stopped. Gwen did not try to tell Cliff that things would be fine, or that there was a silver lining, or that family disagreements had a way of working themselves out. He was grateful for that. When she finally stood to go, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and said, "If you need somewhere tonight, my couch is available and I sleep deeply." He told her he appreciated it. The work crew finished at 4 in the afternoon and drove away. The house sat quiet. Marcus had left hours earlier, not long after Cliff had set the keys in his hand, and had not come back. Yvette had remained to supervise the crew and to lock the house when they were done. She came out now in the low slant of the late afternoon sun and found Cliff still sitting on the front walk with his field book and his photograph in his strongbox. She came toward him and stopped a few feet away. She said quietly enough that it might almost have been something she was saying to herself, "This wasn't easy for us either, you know." Cliff looked at her steadily, "But it was still your choice, both of you." She started to say something else, something about worry about Cliff's well-being, about the practical realities of maintaining a house alone at his age. He let her finish. Then he said, "Yvette, when I was working, I had a foreman named Wendell Sharp, 30 years on the job. Best eye for structural failure I ever saw. He used to say if you wait until a problem is obvious to everybody else, you've already waited too long." He meant it as a compliment to paying attention. But the other way that sentence works is this: if you have to wait until things are falling down before you acknowledge there's a problem, then you haven't really been paying attention at all. Yvette's expression shifted, something moving beneath the composed surface of it. Marcus and I did pay attention, Cliff said. We paid attention to different things. She stood there another moment. Then she went to the door, put the key in the lock, turned it, and walked to her car. She drove away without looking back. Cliff remained where he was. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that late afternoons in early June can be quiet, warm, and slightly heavy, the sounds of the day tapering off into something more ambient and indistinct. Two kids rode bicycles past the end of the driveway. A dog barked once from the yard 3 houses down and then settled. Life continued around him at its ordinary pace, indifferent and relentless. He picked up his things and began to think about where to go. He was still working through the logistics of the evening when the mail truck came around the corner and slowed in front of the house. Boyd Kellner had been driving this route for 15 years. He was a compact, economical man who moved through his workday with a kind of measured precision that Cliff had always respected. Boyd pulled the truck to the curb and got out, which he did not normally do. He looked at Cliff and at the expression on Cliff's face, and something in him decided that this was not a situation for the standard mail slot delivery. "Mr. Denton," he said, "certified letter, needs your signature." Cliff signed. Boyd handed over the envelope, then stood there a moment, in the way a person stands when they want to say something but are not sure whether it is their place to say it. He said it anyway. "You built the equipment shed for my wife's school over at Greenfield Elementary, 2009. I remember you saying the footings needed to go down an extra 8 inches because the drainage map showed a seasonal water table fluctuation. The principal wanted to skip it and save money. You said no." Boyd paused. "That shed is still there. No settling, no cracking, nothing. I drive past it twice a week." Cliff looked at him. "You're the same man," Boyd said. Then he got back in his truck and drove on. Cliff looked down at the return address on the envelope, the law firm of Alcott in Moore, Philadelphia, and below the firm name in smaller type office of the estate of Percival H. Morrow. He stood completely still for a moment. Percival Morrow, Percy, his father's older brother, the man who had been, for as long as Cliff could remember, nothing more than a name that was never quite said. Not a name that was forbidden or argued about, just a name that lived at the edge of conversations and was never brought into the center. When Cliff was young, he had asked his father once why Uncle Percy never visited, and his father had given an answer so brief and so final that Cliff had understood without being told that asking again would not be productive. He had been maybe 7 or 8 years old. After that, he had simply accepted Percy Morrow's absence the way children accept the things their parents make clear are not to be questioned. He had not heard the name spoken in decades. He put the letter in the side pocket of his jacket without opening it. His hands were not entirely steady. This was not the time. He needed to get through the night first, get himself somewhere with a table and decent light, somewhere he could read a document with the attention it deserved. Reaction without information was not a plan. He had built a career on that principle. He picked up his 2 bags, his strong box, and his field book, and he walked the 6 blocks to the Millbrook Central Bus Station. The station was not large. 12 plastic chairs and 2 rows of ticket window, a vending machine that dispensed both beverages and inadequate snacks, and a departures board that clicked through its information on an irregular cycle. The fluorescent lights were the color of old paper. Cliff found a seat near the window and set his things on the chair beside him. He took out the envelope and opened it. The letter from Alcott and Moore was 6 pages dense with legal language and supporting documentation. Cliff was not a lawyer, but he had spent 4 decades reading contracts, permits, specifications, and municipal code, and he moved through legal texts systematically, starting at the beginning, not skipping ahead, looking for the operative clauses. He found them on page 2. He read the paragraph once. Then he turned back to the beginning and read the entire letter again from the top. By the time he finished the second reading, he was sitting differently. His posture changed in some way. He was not consciously aware of something in the set of his shoulders, in the angle of his head, that was different from how he had been sitting an hour ago on the front steps of the house that was no longer his house. Sole legal heir, the estate of Percival H. Morrow, a parcel of land in Grover County, Virginia, with a structure on it. Never registered in any family records, never disclosed to any other member of the family, left entirely and specifically to Clifford Raymond Denton. He sat with that for a long time. Then he did what he had always done when confronted with a new problem of significant scope. He turned to a blank page in his field book and he began to make a list. What he knew, what needed to be verified, what could be wrong, what the immediate next steps were in order of priority. The list took him about 15 minutes to complete. When he was done, he looked at it, made two small corrections, and folded the page so it sat flat inside the front cover of the book. He was reaching for his jacket to find his phone and look up departure times when something made him pause. He reached back into the packet inside the envelope and found what he had missed on the first pass through the documents. A small key copper-colored taped to the inside of the envelope flap with a strip of paper that had the words "Property Structure Front Entrance" written on it in careful handwriting. Cliff held the key in his palm. He looked at the metal strongbox sitting on the chair beside him, the one that had belonged to his father, the one he had carried for 24 years without being able to open it. He held the key close to the strongbox lock and examined both in the fluorescent light. The copper key and the strongbox lock were the same vintage, same manufacturer's style, same dimensions at the bow. He picked up the strongbox and held it in one hand and the key in the other. He sat there in the plastic chair and he did not move for a full minute. Then he put the key in the lock. The mechanism turned with a clean, deliberate click. He felt it release completely beneath his thumb, but he did not lift the lid. Not here, not in this plastic chair under these lights, not when his hands were still, not entirely steady, and he did not yet know what he was going to find. Whatever Percy Morrow had put in that box had waited 24 years. It could wait until morning. He looked up at the departures board. The first bus toward Richmond, Virginia departed at 6:15 in the morning. He bought a ticket. He settled back into his chair with his coat pulled close and his field book in his lap and his strongbox and the letter from Alcott and Moore placed carefully in the bag at his feet. The station was quiet. A young woman across the room was asleep with her head against the wall and a child curled on the two seats beside her. A janitor moved a mop slowly across the far end of the floor. Cliff looked at the window. Outside across the street, a dark gray sedan sat at the curb with its lights off. There was someone in the driver's seat. He watched the car for a moment, the particular stillness of it, the way it was angled to give the driver a clearer view through the bus station window. He looked directly at the car, at the driver's side. He held his gaze there. The engine started. The sedan pulled away from the curb and moved down the street without turning on its headlights until it had gone half a block. Cliff watched it go. Then he turned back to his field book, found the list he had made, and added one more item at the bottom. He underlined it twice. The Greyhound out of Millbrook left at 6:17, 2 minutes behind schedule, and Cliff was in the fourth row on the right side with his bags in the overhead rack and the strong box on the floor between his feet where he could feel it against his ankle. He did not sleep. He opened the field book to the list he had made the night before and read through it once, not to revise it, but to fix it in his mind to make the next several hours feel like the approach to a known problem rather than a fall into an unknown one. Outside the window, Pennsylvania gave way to Maryland, and Maryland gave way to Virginia, the landscape flattening and then rising slightly, the tree cover thickening as the highway moved south and east. At some point, he opened the field book to a page near the back and found a margin notation from 1989. The handwriting was his, but younger. Greenfield job finished. Lorraine brought lunch to the site on the last day and sat with me while I checked the final numbers. She never asked what the numbers meant. She just sat there. He turned the page without reading further. In Richmond, he transferred to a local line that ran southwest toward the smaller counties, and from the final stop he walked. The directions in the Alcott and Moore documents were specific, a route description, rather than a simple address which told him the property predated the area's GPS-era mapping. He followed the route description from memory. Paved road, then gravel, then a dirt track that curved through second-growth timber for better than a third of a mile. He was carrying both bags in the strong box, and the last stretch of trail was steep enough that he had to stop once and set things down and breathe. He stood in the quiet of the woods and listened. No traffic, no machinery, the sound of birds and the movement of air through leaves, and somewhere ahead the intermittent sound of water running over rocks in a small creek. He picked up his bags and kept walking. The clearing opened without warning. One moment he was in the trees and the next he was at the edge of open air, and the house was there. He stopped. He stood at the tree line and looked at it with his eyes rather than his assumptions. It was a one-story frame house built on a full perimeter foundation of coarse fieldstone that someone had mortared with real care. The walls were board and batten, the boards weathered to a silver gray but holding their position without the cupping or splitting that came from poor seasoning or neglect. The roof was medium-pitch standing seam metal, probably installed in the 1970s, based on the profile, and it showed no visible sagging at the ridge of the eaves. The porch ran the full width of the front, supported by posts that were still plumb. He walked the perimeter before he went inside. He went around clockwise, looking at the foundation, the wall base, the window frames, the junctions between different materials. The north side had a small lean-to addition, probably added in the 1960s, that showed slightly more weathering than the main structure, but was still sound. The drainage away from the foundation was good on all four sides. Whoever had sited this house had understood the land. He went to the front porch, climbed the steps, and used the copper key from the envelope on the front door lock. It opened with the slow, deliberate sound of a hinge that had not moved in some time but had been properly maintained. The air inside was cool and dry and held the particular stillness of an enclosed space that had been sealed and left to itself. Not the smell of abandonment, not mold or decay, but something closer to suspension. He stepped in. The main room ran the full width of the house. Furniture stood under canvas drop cloths yellow to the color of old cream. A stone fireplace occupied the center of the north wall, its firebox clean. Bookshelves flanked it on both sides, filled with volumes that stood straight without leaning. A large work table stood near the east window, its surface clear and smooth. He moved through the rooms until he found the study behind the main room. A writing desk positioned under a north-facing window, and on the desk a wooden box fitted with a lock of the same style as his strongbox. He tried the copper key on the wooden box. It fit. Inside a large envelope with his full name written on it in handwriting he did not recognize. A notebook with a dark brown leather cover, the corners worn soft. And at the bottom of the box, face down, a photograph. He picked up the photograph last and turned it over. Two people. One was a man in his late 30s, solidly built, with a face that had spent time outdoors and had lines around the eyes from squinting into the sun. The other was a boy of about 6, holding up a small wooden model of a suspension bridge, with the particular fierce pride of a child displaying something he has helped to make. Cliff knew that bridge. He had kept it in a box of childhood keepsakes through 6 moves over 40 years, always assuming his mother had bought it for him at a toy store, never knowing its actual origin because no one had ever told him. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same handwriting as the envelope, Cliff and Uncle Percy, summer 1959. Our bridge. He set the photograph down and opened the strongbox. His father's documents were inside as he had expected, insurance papers and old correspondence. But at the bottom was something else. A legal agreement dated 1961 between Harold Denton Cliff's father and Percival H. Morrow. The agreement transferred a portion of Percy's early land holdings to Harold in exchange for a signature on a loan guarantee. The transfer was real and documented, but the loan guarantee had been for a venture that failed within 2 years, and Harold had not absorbed the loss or attempted to make Percy whole. Instead, he had kept what had been transferred and ended all contact. Cliff read the document twice. He read the dates, the amounts, the legal language. He understood now why Percy's name had lived at the edge of family conversations and never at the center. The silence had not been grief or distance. It had been concealment. He put the document back in the strongbox, closed the lid, and set it on the shelf above the writing desk. Then he sat down in the desk chair and opened Percy's envelope. Percy's letter was not long. He wrote without sentiment and without apology, which Cliff found he respected. Percy wrote that he had seen clearly what was going to happen to this family. not as prophecy, but as pattern recognition. He had watched the people with access to resources use that access to control those without it. He had watched it happen to Harold's wife. He had expected to watch it happen to Cliff. He wrote that he had chosen Cliff as his heir, not because of family position, but because of one observable fact in 40 years of watching Cliff. From a distance, he had never once seen Cliff take something that belonged to someone else. He had seen Cliff give things away. He had seen Cliff do work that other men claimed. He had seen Cliff stay when leaving would have been easier. He wrote, "If you are reading this, something has already been taken from you. That is not a guess. That is how I designed the timing. The inheritance was structured to arrive when you needed it most, not before. Before you would have shared it. They would have found a way to dissolve it into the general accounts of the family. This way it is yours entirely and there is nothing to negotiate." Cliff put the letter down and sat for a long time with the specific quality of being understood by someone he had never consciously known. He picked up the brown notebook. Percy had kept records methodically with dates and specifics, but the notebook also contained long passages of daily observation. The texture of a life lived alone on land he understood completely. He wrote about the creek in different seasons, about a red-tailed hawk that hunted the eastern field every morning, from October through March, about the properties he had acquired and why. And he wrote about Cliff. There were 23 entries in which Cliff was mentioned by name. Cliff counted them without planning to, and he noticed each one the way you notice your own name in a crowded room. Percy had followed his career, had read local news accounts of projects he completed, had kept a clipping from the Chester County Courier, 1997, about a bridge widening project on Route 30 that had come in on schedule and under budget. The clipping was still tucked between the notebook pages, yellowed and slightly brittle. The entry beside it read, "Our bridge was better, but his will hold longer." Cliff closed the notebook. He went out to the porch and sat on the top step and looked at the clearing. The afternoon light was long, and the shadows of the trees stretched toward the house. He sat on that step and felt something move through him that was adjacent to grief without quite being grief, a recognition of everything that had been adjacent to his life without quite touching it, of all the years this man had known him from a distance, while Cliff had not known he existed. That evening, by the light of his phone, because the power was off, he called Theodore Alcott. The attorney answered on the second ring. He was 70 and he had handled Percy Morrow's legal affairs for 31 years. He drove out from Philadelphia the following afternoon in a dark green sedan that he parked carefully at the edge of the clearing. He was a tall man, slightly stooped, with the unhurried quality of someone who had learned through experience that rushing produced inferior results. They sat at the work table in the main room. Alcott had brought the transfer documents, the full accounting of the estate's assets, and a summary of the legal structures Percy had used to keep everything protected. Alcott said, "I want you to understand something before we go through these. I knew Percy for 31 years. I have never had a client who planned with more precision. Every contingency you can imagine he had addressed. The only variable he could not control was whether you would come." Cliff said, "What would have happened if I hadn't?" "The estate would have remained in trust for 15 years and then been donated to a land conservation organization Percy designated." Alcott paused. "But he told me the last time I saw him that he was not worried about that outcome. He said you would come because you were the kind of man who opened his mail. He meant that you dealt with things directly without avoidance." Alcott laid the asset summary on the table. The number was not astronomical. It was not the kind of number that changes a person's understanding of the world. But it was real and documented and structured in a way that was legally unassailable. Land accounts, two small investments that had compounded over decades. The house and the 47 acres around it. Alcott said, "I have one thing to tell you that you may find difficult to hear." Cliff waited. Percy retained a monitoring service for the last 15 years of his life, a clipping service, and a contact who watched public records. He knew about your wife's death. He knew about your accident on the roof last year. He knew you were in the hospital. Alcott met Cliff's eyes. "When I received word about the roof accident, I called him. He told me to accelerate the documentation. He said the timeline was moving. He was making sure there was no gap between his death and your crisis. Cliff sat with this. Percy had known he was in the hospital, had known and had responded not by calling or appearing, but by ensuring that what he had built for Cliff was ready to arrive at exactly the right moment. The man had treated Cliff's life the way Cliff treated load calculations, with precision, with foresight, and with an absolute refusal to leave critical tolerances to chance. Alcott left in the late afternoon. Before he went to his car, he shook Cliff's hand and said, "Percy was proud of you. He never said it that way, but in 31 years of working with a man, you learned to read what he is not saying." Cliff watched the green sedan go down the dirt road. Then he went inside, stood in the study, and looked at the shelf where he had placed the now empty strongbox. He looked at the photograph of himself at 6 years old, holding a bridge he had built with a man he had been made to forget. He found in the bottom drawer of the writing desk a legal pad. He sat down and began to write a list. Not a list of problems to solve, a list of what was here, what the land had, what the house needed, what could be done in the first month, and what could wait. He wrote for an hour. When he finished, he looked at what he had made, and he understood that he had not done anything like this since 1984, when he and Lorraine had sat at a kitchen table in a rented apartment and written out everything they wanted to do with the house they were about to buy. He had not realized until this moment how much he had missed having a list like this. Not a list of repairs or compliance items. A list of intentions. He capped the pen and went to bed in the back room on the bed Percy had made up with clean linens and covered with a canvas drop cloth. He lay down in the dark and listened to the sounds of the property, the creek, the wind in the trees, the particular quiet of land that had not been subdivided or put to any use except the use of being itself. He was asleep before he finished being surprised by how quickly sleep came. The first week at Grover County was work, and work was the one language Cliff had always spoken without an accent. He started with the electrical panel the morning after Alcott left, because a house without reliable power is not a house anyone can live in, and Cliff had no intention of living in anything less than a functioning structure. He pulled the panel cover and spent 40 minutes with his flashlight, reading the wiring, tracing each circuit by hand, checking the gauge of the runs against the load they were currently carrying. The work was old, but it was honest. Whoever had wired this house in the early 1960s had known what they were doing, had used copper throughout when aluminum was cheaper and more common, had left enough slack at every junction box to allow for future access. Cliff noted these details with the appreciation one craftsman feels when he encounters the careful work of another. 3 sections of wire near the kitchen needed replacing. He drove into Denton and bought what he needed at the hardware store. The woman at the counter looked at his list without comment and pulled everything from the shelves herself. When he paid, she said, "You the man staying out at the Morrow place?" Cliff said he was. She nodded. "Percy used to come in here. Good man. Knew exactly what he needed before he walked through the door." She put his change on the counter. "Never wasted anybody's time." Cliff picked up his bag and said, "Neither do I." He had the kitchen circuits replaced by early afternoon and the panel cover back on before the light got bad. He stood in the kitchen and switched every light on and off twice. Everything worked. He wrote one line in his field book, "Electrical kitchen section complete, balance of panel serviceable." The plumbing he checked the next morning. The water had been shut at the main, and when he reopened it, he walked every room listening for the sound of pressure, finding a weakness. There was none. The water heater was old but functional. He made a note to replace it within 18 months. The roof he saved for the 3rd day because he wanted the weather to be right and because he wanted to be rested. He climbed up before 7 while the air was still cool and the dew had not fully burned off, and he moved across the surface on his hands and knees. Methodically, his weight distributed his attention's total. The field was mostly sound. One section above the back bedroom that showed soft spots in the decking water infiltration from a failed flashing joint at the chimney base. He came down, got his materials, went back up, and fixed it. The repair took 2 hours. When he descended the second time, Harlan Briggs was standing in the yard watching him. "You just climbed down from that roof," Briggs said. He was the county sheriff, 60 years old, and he had shown up at the property 2 days earlier to verify Cliff's ownership documentation, skeptical, in the way of a man whose job required him to be skeptical of things that arrived without warning. "I did," Cliff said. "You're 69 years old. I'm aware of that." Briggs looked at the chimney, then back at Cliff. "Alcott's office called this morning. Got everything squared away on the documentation side. Far as this county is concerned, you're the legal owner of record." Cliff nodded once. Briggs seemed to want to say something more, but could not locate the right words for it. He settled for a single nod in return, then walked back to his truck. Cliff watched him go, then went inside to wash his hands and start the coffee. Gwen arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Cliff had come to Grover County. She had not called ahead in any meaningful sense. She had told him she was coming, and he had said she did not need to, which both of them understood meant she was coming regardless. Her car appeared at the edge of the clearing just before noon. Cliff heard it and came out to the porch. Gwen stepped out and stood in the open air of the clearing and looked at the house for a long moment without speaking. She took in the tree line, the quality of the light, the particular stillness that this place had. Finally, she said, "It looks like you." He said, "You're the second person to say something like that. Then two people are right." She climbed the porch steps and looked at the wood frame and the stonework at the foundation and the repaired section of porch railing. "Not showy," she said, "but everything's where it's supposed to be." She stayed for 4 days. She cooked in the evenings using the cast iron pans she had brought from Millbrook, because she said she did not trust other people's cast iron. And Cliff sat at the kitchen table, and they talked the way old friends talk when they have not had to perform anything for each other in a long time. They talked about the neighborhood, about Lorraine, about the particular quality of grief that sets in, not right after a loss, but years later, when you realize how many small daily things the person used to provide that you cannot quite replicate on your own. On the second evening, Gwen said, "What are you going to do about Marcus?" Cliff was quiet for a while. "I'm going to wait and see what Marcus does about Marcus. And if he does nothing, then I'll have my answer." Gwen moved the pan on the burner. She said, without turning around, "You know Lorraine would want you to leave a door open." Lorraine, Cliff said, "would also want me to stop leaving doors open for people who have already shown me they know how to walk through them uninvited." Gwen laughed, a short, real sound. "Fair enough." On the third day, Stuart Waverly drove up in a rental car and ruined the afternoon. Cliff saw him coming from the kitchen window, saw the rental plates and the suit, and knew before the man had gotten out of the car what this was going to be. He went to the front door and opened it before Waverly reached the porch steps. Waverly was composed, practiced. He introduced himself, offered his card, and said he was there on behalf of Marcus Denton in a personal capacity to discuss the matter of the Morrow estate. Cliff took the card, looked at it, and said, "Come inside." Gwen was in the back room. Cliff did not call her. He brought Waverly into the kitchen and offered nothing, which was his own kind of statement, and sat down across the table from him. Waverly made his case methodically. He said there were reasonable grounds to question the circumstances under which the will had been executed, given Percy Morrow's age and his long isolation from family contact. He said this was not an aggressive position, but a responsible one, a matter of ensuring that all interested parties had been properly considered. Cliff listened to all of it. Then he said, "I'm going to show you something." He went to the cabinet beside the writing desk and came back with a folder he had assembled and labeled on the second day at the property. He set it on the table and opened it. "Medical and psychiatric evaluation of Percival Morrow, signed by his treating physician, dated August 15th, 2021, he said, 6 months before Percy died. Full cognitive assessment. He scored in the 93rd percentile for men his age on every measured dimension." He turned to the next section. "Notarized, will execute it in the presence of 3 witnesses and a federal notary, December 4th, 2021. Witnesses included his physician, his accountant of 30 years, and a neighbor who has lived adjacent to this property since 1978. He turned to the next section. Complete transaction history for every asset in the estate dating to 1958, documented, cross-referenced, consistent. He closed the folder. "That folder holds. What you are describing does not. Waverly looked at the folder. Something passed across his expression and was quickly managed. He said, "You've been thorough." "I'm always thorough." Waverly reached forward and set his phone on the table face up, the microphone end, oriented toward Cliff. Cliff saw it immediately. He had used the same positioning in himself in construction meetings when he needed a record of what a subcontractor had agreed to. He recognized the angle and the stillness of the device. He continued talking, but the content of what he said shifted without pause or signal. He spoke about the weather. He described the condition of the property in terms that were accurate but contained nothing extractable from context. He was pleasant and gave Waverly absolutely nothing. When Waverly left, Cliff watched the rental car back down the dirt road. Then he went to the back room where Gwen was sitting with her book, and he told her what had happened. She looked up. "He recorded you." "Tried to." "Is that legal here?" "No." Cliff picked up his phone. "It is not." He called Alcott. The conversation was brief. Alcott confirmed the relevant Virginia statute and said that Waverly had created a significant professional liability for himself. Cliff said to document it completely, but hold the option in reserve. Alcott said he already had. Cliff put the phone down and stood at the kitchen window. The clearing was quiet in the late afternoon. A pair of birds he could not identify were working over something at the edge of the tree line. Gwen came and stood beside him. "What happens now?" "Waverly files the challenge. Alcott answers it. A judge looks at that folder and makes a decision that should take about 15 minutes. And Marcus," Cliff was quiet, "Marcus sent Waverly here because Marcus is not yet ready to come himself. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That he still knows the difference between right and wrong. People who have lost that completely don't send a representative to do the uncomfortable thing. They just do it themselves without discomfort." Gwen considered this. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's an accurate one," Cliff said. "I'm not being generous. I'm being precise." The hearing at Grover County Circuit Court was on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. Cliff drove himself. Alcott met him in the parking lot carrying a briefcase that contained the folder Cliff had assembled, plus 3 additional supporting documents. The courtroom was small and worn and smelled of old wood and recycled air. Cliff sat beside Alcott at the respondent's table and noted that Marcus was not present. The chair beside Waverly was empty. Judge Emmett Cranshaw was 62 heavy-set, with the deliberate economy of movement that Cliff associated with people who had spent long careers making consequential decisions and had learned to conserve energy for the ones that mattered. He read Waverly's filing without visible reaction. He read Alcott's response. He asked one question directed at Waverly about the specific basis for contesting cognitive capacity given the documented medical evaluation. Waverly's answer was careful but thin. Cranshaw looked at him for a moment after he finished, the kind of look that contains a conclusion the speaker has not yet been told. Then Cranshaw looked at the full record and said, "There is no legal basis presented here sufficient to challenge this instrument. The will is valid and enforceable. Motion denied." Waverly closed his folder, gathered his materials with the controlled efficiency of a man absorbing a professional loss, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Cliff. The sound of his footsteps on the old wooden floor was the last Cliff heard of him. Cliff and Alcott shook hands on the courthouse steps. Alcott said the final transfer documents would be ready to sign by the end of the week. Cliff thanked him. He was walking to his truck when he heard his name. Harlan Briggs was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps in civilian clothes, a flannel shirt and work pants. Off duty, he had come here on his own time. "Mr. Denton," Briggs said. He paused, looking for the right way into what he wanted to say. "Percy Morrow built the access road to Denton Elementary School in 1972. The district didn't have the budget, and the state grant fell through, and the kids were walking on the shoulder of Route 9. Percy showed up one morning with a rented grader and a load of gravel, and he built that road in 3 days. Didn't charge the district a cent." Briggs looked at the ground for a moment. "I was 10 years old. I walked that road every day for 6 years. He looked back up. "I just thought you should know who he was." Cliff stood on the courthouse steps and looked at Harlan Briggs. This man who had shown up at the property twice to question him and had returned today for no reason except to say this one thing, and he felt something shift in the vicinity of his chest. Thank you, Cliff said. Briggs nodded and walked to his truck. Cliff stood there another moment in the morning air, looking at the small buildings and the old trees and the courthouse that had just in 15 minutes confirmed what Percy had arranged over 60 years of careful, quiet work. The call from Marcus came on a Saturday evening, 10 days after the hearing. Cliff was on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the sun go down behind the tree line. His phone showed Marcus's name. He looked at it for 2 full rings. Then he answered. Dad? Marcus's voice was different from every other time Cliff had heard it in the past several months. The prepared quality was gone. What was left sounded like his son, specifically the 43-year-old man who had once been the boy Cliff drove to Little League practice on Saturday mornings, and who had sat in the truck on the way home asking questions about bridges and buildings and why some things lasted and others didn't. I've been trying to figure out how to make this call for 2 weeks. Cliff said, you made it. I owe you an apology. I know that's not sufficient, but I want to say it directly. What I did was wrong, not just legally, not just practically. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway. Cliff sat with that. He let it exist without filling the space around it. Marcus said, I treated you like a liability, like something that needed to be managed instead of a person who had a right to make his own decisions. I told myself I was doing it for practical reasons, but the practical reasons were a story I told myself, so I didn't have to look at what I was actually doing. Which was what? Cliff asked. A silence, then taking the easy path, the one where I made the decision and you lived with it, instead of the one where we had an honest conversation that might have gone badly. Cliff looked at the tree line. He said, do you know who Percy Morrow was? Your uncle. Do you know what kind of man he was? Marcus said he did not. He was the kind of man who built a road for children to walk to school because the alternative was that they walked on the shoulder of a highway. He spent 60 years building something carefully and quietly, without recognition, without anyone knowing, so that one day it could land in the hands of the right person at exactly the right moment. Cliff paused. He watched me for 30 years from a distance. He watched me work. He saw me clearly when I couldn't even see him. Marcus was quiet. He left this to me. Cliff said, because I was the one in this family who built things instead of taking them. He saw that. I want you to see it too, not so you feel worse, so you understand what is actually being talked about here. A silence. Then Marcus said, I found something when we were clearing out the house, in the bottom of the filing cabinet in the garage, an old legal document, 1961, between your father and someone named Percival Morrow. Cliff had not expected this. I didn't understand what it was at first, Marcus said, but I had Waverly look at it. Another silence longer. Granddad took something from Percy. He took it and then cut him off. And he stopped. I was doing the same thing. I didn't see it until I saw that document. Cliff said nothing for a moment. Then, where is the document now? I have it. I want to bring it to you. In person, if you'll let me come. Cliff looked out at the clearing at the night settling into the tree line. Come in the fall, he said. The trees are something in October out of here, apparently. Come by yourself, no folders, no Waverly, just you. Okay, Dad. And when you get here, I'm going to tell you about Percy Morrow. Everything I know. And you're going to tell me what you're going to build, not acquire, build. That's the conversation I want to have. A long silence. Okay, Marcus said. I'll be there. After he hung up, Cliff sat on the porch for a long time. The night had settled fully, the sky above the tree line showing the first stars, and the air had the quality of rural Virginia evenings in summer, warm and faintly green-smelling, full of the small sounds of things going about their business in the dark. He went inside and got the field book. He sat back down on the porch with it open on his knee, the pen light from his shirt pocket aimed at the pages. He turned to the drawing he had made on the first full day in Grover County, the initial site assessment diagram roughed out by hand from memory after walking the perimeter of the property. It was accurate but skeletal, the kind of first pass you make when you want to establish the basic facts before you think about anything else. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned to a clean page and began to draw again. This was not a site assessment. This was a building survey, the kind you make when you are not diagnosing a structure, but claiming it when you are declaring your intention to understand every element of a thing and work with it deliberately. He drew the footprint of the house room by room, with dimensions estimated from pacing the floors. He noted the location of every window and the direction it faced. He wrote in the margin beside the kitchen, "East-facing morning light to 10 a.m. exceptional for growing season." Beside the study where Percy's writing desk stood, "North light consistent good for detailed work." Beside the back bedroom, "Repaired flashing monitor annually structurally sound." He worked for the better part of an hour. When he had finished the house diagram, he moved to the land, sketching the tree line and the clearing and the dirt road and the property boundaries. He noted the drainage patterns he had observed during the one heavy rain of his first week. He noted the soil composition from the test excavation he had done near the foundation. He noted the prevailing wind direction. When he finally set the pen down, the page was full. He looked at what he had made, not at any single detail, but at the whole of it, the way you step back from a completed drawing to understand what it says when you stop focusing on the parts. He had done this 10,000 times in his life, and each time the result was slightly different, because each structure was different, because no two pieces of ground were the same, because the combination of a specific building on a specific piece of earth in a specific condition of time and weather and use was always in the end unrepeatable. He reached for the field book and held it so the porch light fell across the inside of the front cover. Lorraine's note was still there, "For the man who fixes everything. Now fix this too." He had never known what she meant him to fix. He thought he might know now. He thought she might have meant yourself. Not that he was broken. Lorraine had never thought him broken, but she had always seen the thing in him, that he sometimes lost sight of the capacity not just to maintain what existed, but to begin something entirely new, to look at a blank page and decide what would go on it, rather than waiting for someone else to determine that for him. He turned the book so the back and side cover faced up, and he looked at it carefully in the penlight's beam. He had examined this page once before in the low light of his first night at the writing desk and had missed what was there. He did not miss it now. The handwriting was not Lorraine's. The pen was different, a slightly heavier nib. The letters formed with the deliberate quality of someone who did not write often, but wrote carefully when they did. The ink was faded in a way that placed it years earlier. It said, "Every bridge starts with one line. Draw it. PM." Percy Morrow had held this field book, had been close enough to it at some point in some way that Cliff could not reconstruct, to open the back cover and leave two sentences. The model bridge from 1959. The newspaper clipping saved for decades. And now this. Percy had never been as absent as the family had made him seem. He had been present in the only ways the family's silence had allowed him to be. Cliff sat with this for a long time. He was not a man given to the language of fate or providence. He had spent his life in a world governed by physics and load tolerances, in the behavior of materials under stress. He believed in what could be measured, in what could be verified, in what held when weight was applied to it. But he also knew from 48 years of building things that occasionally you encountered a structure designed for a purpose so specifically and with such foresight that the only honest response was to stand before it and acknowledge that someone had seen farther down the road than you had. Percy had seen farther down the road. He had seen a boy who liked to build things and had made sure that when everything else was taken from that boy 60 years later, there would be something left, something real. Something with a foundation that had been checked and found solid, with a roof that could stand for another 50 years, given proper care, with 47 acres of Virginia that no one could take because Percy had made it legally impossible for anyone to take it. Ed looked up from the book at the clearing in front of him, at the dark shapes of the trees and the stars above them, at the night air moving through the grass. He turned back to the drawing he had made of the property. He found the bottom right corner of the page, the space he always reserved for the project information block, the field where a drawing officially became a record rather than a sketch. He wrote, "Project Morrow, Property, Grover County, Virginia." He wrote, "Start date June 17, 2022. He wrote owner of record Clifford Raymond Denton. And then because it was true and because he was a man who understood the value of saying true things plainly, he wrote one more line. He had never written a line like this in 48 years of field books, had never used this space for anything except technical data. But he wrote it now, and it fit, and it was accurate, and it held. This one is mine. He closed the book. He sat on the porch of the house that Percy Morrow had built and maintained for 60 years and left in trust for the right person at the right moment, and he listened to the night, and the night had nothing ominous in it. It was simply the sound of a place continuing to exist, which was all any well-built thing was ever trying to do. Tomorrow he would start on the list of what came next. Marcus would come in October. The trees would be turning by then all the colors that Virginia could manage in the fall, and there would be a great deal to show him and a great deal to say. There was work still to be done, and Cliff had always been good at work, and he had for the first time in a long time exactly the right place to do it.